8-year-old Marcus wiped down another greasy plate in the back kitchen of Romano's fine dining, his small hands struggling with the industrial-sized dish soap dispenser. The expensive restaurant buzzed with the evening crowd, but Marcus could hear something that made his heart ache, a baby's desperate crying echoing from the dining room. He didn't know that at table 7 sat Victoria and Richard Blackstone, owners of a billion-dollar tech empire, growing increasingly frustrated with the noise. He didn't know their infant daughter wouldn't stop crying despite every attempt to soothe her. He didn't know that in his worn backpack sat a small, tattered stuffed rabbit that would change 4 lives forever. What Marcus did know was that somewhere out there, a baby needed help, and he had something that might make it better. But could one simple act of kindness bridge the gap between 2 completely different worlds? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button for more real, emotional, life-changing stories like this, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Marcus pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, his mother's voice calling after him to stay in the back, but the crying had grown louder, more desperate. The dining room of Romanos was a world away from the cramped apartment he shared with his mother, Maria. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in pristine white linens, where men in expensive suits and women dripping with jewelry enjoyed meals that cost more than his family's monthly grocery budget. His eyes found the source of the distress immediately. At a corner table, a well-dressed couple sat rigid with embarrassment as their baby girl wailed inconsolably in her high chair. The woman, Victoria Blackstone, though Marcus didn't know her name, wore a dress that probably cost more than his mother's yearly salary. Her perfectly styled blonde hair had begun to show signs of stress, and her manicured fingers drummed anxiously against the table. Across from her, Richard Blackstone checked his Rolex for the 3rd time in 2 minutes, his jaw clenched with the kind of tension that came from being used to controlling everything except his own child. "This is ridiculous," Richard muttered under his breath, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "We should have left her with the nanny." Victoria's green eyes flashed with a mixture of frustration and maternal guilt. "She was fine 20 minutes ago. I don't understand what's wrong with her." The baby, about 10 months old with wispy brown curls and tear-streaked cheeks, continued her protest against the unfamiliar environment. Her tiny fists waved in the air as if trying to grasp something that would make sense of this overwhelming world of clinking glasses, conversations, and bright lights. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. He recognized that kind of crying, the way it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than hunger or discomfort. It was the cry of someone who needed comfort, who needed to feel safe. His hand instinctively moved to his backpack, where his fingers found the familiar soft texture of worn velvet. The stuffed rabbit had been his companion for as long as he could remember. Its original bright blue color had faded to a gentle gray, and one ear hung slightly lower than the other, from countless nights of being held tight during thunderstorms, or when the sounds from neighboring apartments grew too loud. His mother had found it at a thrift store when he was 3, spending money they couldn't afford because she saw how his eyes lit up when he spotted it on the shelf. Mr. Hopscotch, he had named it, though he'd never told anyone the name out loud. It seemed too precious, too private to share. The rabbit had absorbed his tears during the hardest nights when the electricity was shut off, when dinner was nothing but crackers and peanut butter. When he heard his mother crying through the thin walls, and wished desperately that he was old enough to fix everything that was broken in their world. Now, watching this baby cry with the same desperate need for comfort, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The dining room around him seemed to fade, the concerned whispers of other patrons and the clatter of silverware becoming a distant hum. All he could focus on was the little girl's face, red and scrunched with misery. He took a step forward, then another. His worn sneakers, held together with duct tape his mother had carefully applied to make them last another month, made no sound on the thick carpet. Several diners noticed the small boy moving between tables, his presence so unexpected in this upscale establishment that conversations began to pause. Victoria was bouncing the baby gently, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure. "Shh, Isabella. Please. Mommy's here. Daddy's here." But Isabella only cried harder, as if the desperation in her mother's voice amplified her own distress. Richard's face had gone from annoyed to mortified as he noticed the stares from neighboring tables. The Blackstones were accustomed to attention, but not this kind. In boardrooms and charity galas, they commanded respect through their wealth and influence. Here, faced with their daughter's meltdown, they were just another pair of overwhelmed parents, and Richard clearly wasn't handling the vulnerability well. "We need to leave," he said, starting to signal for the waiter. "We haven't finished dinner," Victoria replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "People are staring, Victoria. This isn't working." It was at that moment that Marcus appeared beside their table, so quietly that neither parent noticed him at first. He stood there for a moment, studying the baby's face, with the serious concentration of someone far older than his 8 years. Isabella's crying had reached a pitch that made nearby patrons wince, but Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly reached into his backpack. Victoria was the first to notice him. Her head snapped up, her mouth opening to ask what he was doing there, but something in his expression stopped her. There was no curiosity in his dark eyes, no judgment, just a deep, genuine concern that seemed strange coming from someone so young. "Excuse me," she began, but Marcus was already moving. He pulled Mr. Hopscotch from his backpack with the careful reverence of someone handling something precious. The stuffed rabbit looked even more worn under the restaurant's bright lights, its faded fabric and loose stitching evident against the pristine table setting. Richard's first instinct was to shoo the boy away, his businessman's mind cataloging everything from the child's second-hand clothes to his presence in the kitchen area. But something about the moment held him in place. Marcus held the rabbit out toward Isabella, not thrusting it at her but offering it gently, the way someone might approach a frightened animal. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crying. "Mr. Hopscotch helps when you're scared." The baby's crying faltered for just a moment, her attention caught by this new presence. Her wide brown eyes, still swimming with tears, focused on the stuffed animal with its kind, embroidered face and soft, welcoming appearance. Victoria found herself holding her breath. Richard's hand, which had been reaching for his phone to call their driver, froze mid-motion. The entire restaurant seemed to pause, watching this unexpected interaction unfold. Marcus slowly moved the rabbit closer, making it hop gently on the edge of the high chair. "See? He's friendly. He likes babies." His voice carried a warmth that seemed to wrap around Isabella's distress, and gradually, incredibly, her crying began to subside. The silence that followed was profound. Isabella reached out with one chubby hand, her fingers grasping at the rabbit's soft ear. When she made contact, her face transformed. The redness began to fade from her cheeks, and a sound that wasn't crying escaped her lips, something almost like a giggle. "Oh my God," Victoria breathed, her eyes wide with disbelief. Marcus smiled then, the first real smile anyone in the restaurant had seen from him that evening. He gently placed the rabbit in Isabella's hands, helping her small fingers curl around it. "He's magic," he told her seriously. "My mom says he chases away all the scary things." Isabella immediately brought the rabbit to her face, nuzzling its soft fabric against her cheek. The transformation was complete. Where moments before had been inconsolable distress, now there was peace. She made soft, contented sounds, examining her new friend with the intense fascination that only babies possess. The restaurant slowly came back to life, the tension that had been building around table 7 dissipating like smoke. Conversations resumed, silverware clanked against plates, and the normal rhythm of an expensive dinner service continued. But at table 7, everything had changed. Richard stared at Marcus, as if seeing him for the first time. This wasn't just any child who had wandered over from the kitchen area. This was someone who had recognized their desperation and responded with a generosity that left him speechless. The boy had given away what was clearly a treasured possession to help a stranger's child, asking for nothing in return. "Thank you," Victoria managed, her voice thick with emotion she wasn't used to feeling in public. This is incredibly kind." Marcus shrugged, the gesture somehow both childish and wise. "She needed it more than me." "But it's yours," Richard found himself saying. "It's obviously important to you." For a moment, Marcus's composure flickered. His eyes moved to Isabella, who was now babbling happily to Mr. Hopscotch, and something passed across his face that was too complex for his years. "It's okay. He'll take good care of her. Marcus." The sharp voice cut through the moment like a blade. Maria Gonzalez pushed through the kitchen doors, her face flushed with panic and embarrassment. At 32, she looked older, the stress of single motherhood and financial hardship having carved lines around her eyes that shouldn't have been there yet. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her uniform, a simple black dress required by the restaurant, was damp with dishwater and sweat. "I'm sorry, so sorry," she said quickly to the Blackstones, her accent thickening with anxiety. "Marcus, what are you doing out here? You know you're supposed to stay in the kitchen." "It's fine," Victoria said quickly, surprising herself with how much she meant it. He was helping. Maria's eyes took in the scene, her son standing beside the wealthy couple's table, the baby now contentedly playing with what she recognized as Marcus's most prized possession. Her heart sank. "Marcus, no. You can't just give away your things." "The baby was crying, Mama. She needed Mr. Hopscotch." The simple explanation hung in the air, and Maria felt her throat tighten. She knew how much that rabbit meant to her son, knew it was the one constant in his life when everything else felt uncertain. Seeing it now, in a stranger's child's hands, felt like watching a piece of her son's security slip away. "We should pay for it," Richard said suddenly, reaching for his wallet. "What's it worth? 20? 50? The offer landed wrong, and Maria's spine straightened with pride. "It's not for sale, sir. It's just, Marcus, you can't give away your toys to customers." But she stopped crying, Marcus pointed out, his logic simple and unshakable. Victoria watched this exchange with growing fascination. The mother was clearly mortified by her son's behavior, but not because it was cruel or inappropriate. She was embarrassed by his generosity, by the way it reflected their circumstances. The boy, meanwhile, seemed genuinely puzzled by the adult's concern. In his world, helping someone in distress was simply what you did. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Victoria asked Marcus, her voice gentler than it had been all evening. "Marcus Gonzalez," he replied, glancing at his mother for permission to speak. "I'm Victoria, and this is my husband Richard. This is our daughter Isabella." She gestured to the baby, who was now contentedly gnawing on one of the rabbit's ears. "Isabella seems to love your friend." "Mr. Hopscotch is good at making people feel better," Marcus said with the confidence of someone stating an obvious fact. Richard studied the boy more carefully. There was something remarkable about his composure, the way he seemed completely unintimidated by their expensive clothes and the formal restaurant setting. Most children his age would be overwhelmed or showing off, but Marcus carried himself with a quiet dignity that was both heartbreaking and impressive. "Maria, right?" Richard addressed the mother, who nodded nervously. "You work here?" "Yes, sir. In the kitchen. Dishwashing, prep work, whatever they need." Her voice carried the weariness of someone who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. "And Marcus helps?" Maria's cheeks flushed deeper. Having her son work in the restaurant wasn't exactly legal, but the owner, Mr. Romano, was kind enough to look the other way. Marcus would come straight from school to help with simple tasks, earning a few dollars and a meal. It wasn't ideal, but it was survival. "Just small things," she said carefully. "He's very responsible for his age." Victoria and Richard exchanged a look, one of those wordless conversations that couples in long marriages develop. There was something about this family that intrigued them, something that went beyond the immediate kindness Marcus had shown. "Marcus," Victoria said, "would you like to sit with us for a moment? Isabella seems very happy with your friend." Maria started to protest, but Marcus was already moving toward an empty chair. He climbed up with the careful movements of someone used to adult-sized furniture, his legs swinging freely above the ground. "Where do you go to school?" Richard asked, his tone more conversational now. "Jefferson Elementary," Marcus replied. "I'm in 3rd grade. Mrs. Patterson is my teacher. She's nice, but she talks really loud." Despite everything, Victoria found herself smiling. "Do you like school?" Marcus considered this seriously. "I like learning, but sometimes it's hard to pay attention when you're hungry." The casual admission hit both adults like a physical blow. Maria's face went white, and she reached for her son's shoulder. "Marcus, you don't need to tell them everything." But the damage was done, not in any harmful sense, but in the way that truth sometimes illuminates more than intended. Richard and Victoria both understood what wasn't being said. The careful budgeting and sacrifice that went into making sure Marcus could attend school. The reality of a family where an 8-year-old worried about having enough to eat. Isabella chose that moment to let out a delighted squeal, holding Mr. Hopscotch high above her head as if showing him off to the world. The sound broke some of the tension, and Marcus grinned. "She likes him," he said with satisfaction. "She loves him," Victoria corrected, and she meant it. The change in her daughter was remarkable. Isabella had always been a fussy baby, difficult to soothe and easily overwhelmed. But with the stuffed rabbit, she seemed completely at peace. The waiter appeared tableside, his expression carefully neutral despite the unusual situation. "Is everything satisfactory?" he asked, though his eyes kept drifting to Marcus, clearly wondering if he should be asked to leave. "Everything's perfect," Richard said firmly, and the waiter retreated. They talked for nearly an hour. Marcus answered their questions with the openness of childhood, telling them about his favorite subjects, reading and art, his dreams, he wanted to be a teacher or maybe a doctor, and his daily routine: school, then the restaurant, then homework by the light of whatever was available at home. Maria tried several times to excuse them, conscious of taking up the wealthy couple's time, but Victoria kept asking questions, genuinely interested in their story. As the evening wore on, the restaurant began to empty. Other diners finished their meals and left, but the Blackstones remained, seemingly in no hurry to end this unexpected encounter. Isabella had fallen asleep in her high chair, Mr. Hopscotch clutched tightly in her arms, a picture of perfect contentment. "We should go," Maria finally said, when the busboys began clearing nearby tables. "Marcus has school tomorrow." "Of course," Victoria said, though she seemed reluctant to end the evening. "Marcus, thank you again for sharing your friend with Isabella. That was incredibly kind." Marcus slid down from his chair, looking suddenly shy. "Will you tell her goodbye from me? When she wakes up?" "Every day," Victoria promised, and meant it. As they prepared to leave, Richard did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He stood and extended his hand to Marcus for a formal handshake. "It's been an honor meeting you, Marcus. You're a remarkable young man." Marcus took the handshake seriously, his small hand disappearing in Richard's larger one. "Thank you, sir. Take good care of Mr. Hopscotch." "We will," Richard promised. They parted ways in the restaurant's lobby, the Blackstones waiting for their driver while Maria and Marcus prepared for the long bus ride home. But as the family disappeared into the night, Richard found himself unable to shake the encounter from his mind. "We can't just let this end here," he said to Victoria as they settled into the back of their Mercedes. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she suspected she knew. "That boy, that family. Did you see the way he talked about being hungry at school? Did you notice his shoes?" Victoria had noticed. She'd noticed the carefully mended clothes, the way Marcus ate the complimentary bread with the intensity of someone who wasn't sure when his next meal would come. The quiet dignity with which both mother and son carried themselves despite their obvious struggles. "What are you suggesting?" she asked carefully. Richard was quiet for a long moment, watching the city pass by through tinted windows. They lived in a world of charity galas and tax-deductible donations, of writing checks to causes that looked good in the society pages. But this felt different. This felt personal. "I want to know more about them," he said finally. "I want to understand how a child in this city can be that generous, that wise, while clearly living in poverty." Victoria looked down at Isabella, still sleeping peacefully with the worn rabbit. "He gave her his most precious thing," she said softly, without thinking twice about it. "That's exactly what I mean." Their driver, the discreet professional who had worked for the family for years, cleared his throat gently. "Excuse me, Mr. Blackstone, but I couldn't help overhearing. The bus they're taking, number 47, I know that route. It goes to some of the poorest neighborhoods in the city." Richard and Victoria exchanged another look. "Follow it," Richard said quietly. "Sir? Follow the bus. I want to see where they live." It wasn't their usual behavior. The Blackstones were private people who respected others' privacy in return. But something about the evening had shifted their perspective, opened a window into a world they knew existed but had never really seen up close. The bus lumbered through the city streets, making frequent stops. Through the back window, they could occasionally see Marcus and his mother, the boy's head resting against her shoulder as fatigue from the long day caught up with him. Maria kept one arm around her son, while the other clutched her purse, alert to their surroundings in the way of someone who had learned to be careful. The bus route took them through increasingly run-down neighborhoods, past convenience stores with barred windows and apartment buildings that had seen better decades. Streetlights became fewer and farther between, and the Mercedes drew curious stares from the sidewalks. Finally, after nearly 40 minutes, they watched Marcus and Maria disembark at a stop in front of a 3-story apartment building that looked like it was held together by good intentions and stubborn pride. The brick facade was cracked in several places, fire escapes hung at precarious angles, and several windows were covered with plywood instead of glass. "My God," Victoria whispered. They watched from half a block away as mother and son approached the building's entrance. Maria fumbled with multiple locks, while Marcus waited patiently beside her, his school backpack slung over one shoulder. The front door stuck, requiring Maria to put her shoulder against it before it finally gave way. "Keep driving," Richard told the driver, his voice hoarse. Slowly, as they passed the building, Victoria noticed details that painted a fuller picture of the family's circumstances. Laundry hung from fire escapes, creating a patchwork of colors against the brick. Children's toys were scattered in the small front yard, most of them broken or weathered. The building's mailboxes were dented, and some hung open, suggesting security was an ongoing concern. They drove in silence for several blocks before Richard finally spoke. "Take us home." "Yes, sir." But as their driver navigated back toward their own neighborhood, where houses sat on manicured lots behind security gates, both Richard and Victoria found themselves changed by what they had witnessed. The contrast was stark, almost obscene in its disparity. They lived in a world where a single dinner at Romano's cost more than some families earned in a week, where their daughter's nursery contained toys worth more than most people's monthly rent. And yet, it was their daughter who had been comforted tonight by a child who had almost nothing but gave freely anyway. "He didn't hesitate," Victoria said suddenly. When he saw Isabella crying, he didn't think about what it would cost him. He just acted. Richard nodded, his throat tight. "When was the last time we did something like that? Something that actually mattered?" They both knew the answer. Their charitable giving was substantial but distant. Checks written to organizations that sent thank-you letters and tax documents, but no real connection to the lives they were theoretically improving. They attended fundraisers where the cost of their table could feed a family for months, patting themselves on the back for their generosity, while never actually encountering the people they claimed to help. "What do we do?" Victoria asked. "I don't know yet," Richard admitted. "But we can't pretend we didn't see this." At home in their mansion, with Isabella finally settled in her crib still clutching Mr. Hopscotch, they sat in their living room, each lost in thought. The room was larger than most people's entire apartments, filled with expensive furniture and art that they'd collected over the years. But tonight, it felt hollow somehow, lacking the warmth they'd witnessed in the simple interaction between a mother and son who clearly had each other and little else. "I keep thinking about what he said," Victoria mused. "About being hungry at school." Richard was researching on his laptop, his fingers flying over the keys with the focused intensity he usually reserved for business deals. "According to these statistics, nearly 30% of children in this city are food insecure. 30%, Victoria. That's hundreds of thousands of kids. Kids like Marcus." "Kids like Marcus," he agreed. Victoria picked up her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. "I'm calling Romanos." "Victoria, it's almost midnight. I'm calling the emergency line. I need to know more about them." The conversation was brief but illuminating. The restaurant owner, Tony Romano, was initially reluctant to discuss his employees, But when Victoria explained the evening's events, his attitude shifted. "Maria's a good woman," he said finally. "Works harder than anyone I know. She's been with us for 2 years, never missed a day unless the boy was sick. And Marcus? That kid's special. Polite, responsible, always does his homework at the back table while his mother finishes her shift." "Does she have other work?" Victoria asked. "Cleaning office buildings at night, after she leaves here. Sometimes she brings Marcus with her because she can't afford a babysitter. Kid falls asleep on the couch in whatever office she's cleaning." Tony paused. "Look, I don't usually talk about my employees' business, but if you're thinking of helping them, they could use it. Maria's too proud to ask for anything, but they're struggling." After ending the call, Victoria found Richard still researching, his laptop screen filled with articles about childhood poverty, educational inequity, and the cycle of economic disadvantage. "Listen to this," he said, reading from an article. "Children who experience food insecurity are twice as likely to have behavioral problems in school, not because they're troublemakers, but because hunger affects their ability to concentrate and learn." Marcus said it was hard to pay attention when he was hungry, Victoria remembered. And yet his teacher probably has no idea. The article says many children hide their hunger out of shame or pride. They stayed up until nearly 3 in the morning, researching and planning. By dawn, they had the outline of an idea that was both simple and complex, generous and carefully considered. "We need to be smart about this," Richard said as the sun began to rise over their meticulously landscaped grounds. "We can't just throw money at them and walk away. That's not what Marcus deserves." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we start with Maria. If we can help her find better work, more stable income, that helps Marcus too. But it has to be real work, something she can take pride in, not charity disguised as employment." Victoria nodded, understanding his reasoning. They'd encountered enough pride in their brief interaction with the family to know that any help would need to be offered carefully, respectfully. "And Marcus's education?" "That's where it gets interesting," Richard said, pulling up a new webpage. "I've been looking at private schools, but also at programs that support gifted children from low-income families. There are scholarships, mentorship programs, all sorts of opportunities, but most families don't know they exist. So we become a bridge." "Exactly." They spent the morning making phone calls, leveraging their business connections and social network in ways they never had before. Richard reached out to colleagues who ran companies that might have positions for someone with Maria's work ethic and reliability. Victoria contacted friends who served on the boards of private schools and educational foundations. By noon, they had several promising leads and a plan that felt both ambitious and achievable. "We need to see them again," Victoria said. "But how do we approach this without making them feel like charity cases?" Richard smiled for the first time since they'd gotten home. "I think I know exactly how." The next evening found them back at Romano's, but this time they'd made a reservation and specifically requested Maria as their server. When she appeared tableside, her expression carefully professional but clearly surprised to see them again, Victoria smiled warmly. "Maria, hello. We were hoping you could help us with something." "Of course," Maria replied, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Yesterday, your son showed incredible kindness to our daughter," Richard began. "We've been thinking about it ever since, and we'd like to do something to thank your family properly." Maria's posture stiffened slightly. "That's not necessary, sir. Marcus was just being nice." "Which is exactly why it is necessary," Victoria said gently. "Kindness like that deserves to be recognized." They'd rehearsed this conversation, knowing they would need to navigate Maria's pride carefully. The goal was to present opportunities, not handouts, to find ways to honor the family's dignity while providing real help. "We own a technology consulting firm," Richard continued. "We're always looking for reliable people to join our team, and after seeing your work ethic here, we wondered if you might be interested in a position with us." Maria blinked, clearly not expecting this direction. What kind of position?" "Office management, to start. Coordinating schedules, managing communications, keeping everything running smoothly. The hours would be better than what you're doing now, and the benefits package includes health insurance." "And Educational assistance. The last part was key. They'd spent hours crafting a benefits package that would naturally include support for Marcus's education, without singling him out or making it seem like charity. Educational assistance? Maria asked carefully. For employees and their children, Victoria explained. Tutoring programs, scholarship applications, even private school tuition if that's something you'd want to explore for Marcus. Maria was quiet for a long moment, processing the offer. Around them, the restaurant continued its normal rhythm, but at their table, the air felt charged with possibility. "Why?" she asked finally. "You don't know us." It was Richard who answered, his voice more honest than it had been in years of business negotiations. "Because your son gave our daughter something precious, without thinking twice about it. Because in 5 minutes of conversation, he showed more wisdom and compassion than most adults display in a lifetime. Because we believe that kindness like that should be nurtured and supported, not ignored." End quote. "And because we need good people on our team," Victoria added, wanting to emphasize that this wasn't charity. "We wouldn't offer you a job if we didn't think you could do it well." Maria's eyes filled with tears she fought to control. "I would need to arrange childcare for Marcus after school." "Our office has an after-school program for employees' children," Richard said. "Homework help, snacks, safe supervision until parents finish work." It was almost too good to be true, and Maria's expression showed her struggle to believe it. She'd been disappointed too many times, had learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too generous. "Could I think about it?" she asked. "Of course," Victoria said. "Take all the time you need." As they talked through the practical details, Marcus appeared from the kitchen, his face lighting up when he saw them. "Hi," he said, approaching their table with the same fearless friendliness he'd shown the night before. "How's Isabella? Is she still happy with Mr. Hopscotch?" "She's perfect," Victoria assured him. "In fact, we brought pictures." She pulled out her phone, showing Marcus photos of Isabella from that morning, the stuffed rabbit prominently featured in each one. In one picture, Isabella was in her high chair, feeding breakfast to the rabbit. In another, she was in her crib, the toy tucked securely under her arm as she slept. Marcus beamed with satisfaction. "He's taking good care of her." "The best care," Richard agreed. "Marcus, we were just talking to your mother about a job opportunity. What would you think about coming to work with her after school instead of coming here?" Marcus looked between his mother and the Blackstones, his young mind clearly working through the implications. "Would there be other kids there?" "Some," Victoria said. "And lots of books, computers for homework, even some games." "Could I still help Mama with her work?" The question revealed so much about their relationship, about Marcus's sense of responsibility and his desire to contribute to their family's survival. Richard felt his throat tighten. "I think your mama might have different work that doesn't need as much help," he said gently. "Which would give you more time for school activities, maybe sports or music or art classes." Marcus's eyes widened. "Art classes? Do you like art?" Victoria asked. "I love drawing," Marcus said, his enthusiasm breaking through his usual composure. "But we don't have art at school anymore. They cut the program." Richard and Victoria exchanged another of their looks. They were beginning to understand the full scope of what was missing from Marcus's educational experience, the opportunities that were simply unavailable to children in his circumstances. "Well," Victoria said carefully, "maybe we could find you some art classes outside of school." The conversation continued for another hour, with Marcus gradually warming to the idea of a new routine, new opportunities. His questions were insightful, focusing not just on what he might gain, but on how the changes would affect his mother and their life together. Finally, as the restaurant began to empty, Maria made her decision. "I'd like to try," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all evening. When I start?" "Monday, if that works for you," Richard said. "We'll arrange for someone to help you transition, learn the systems, get comfortable." "And Marcus?" Monday for him too. Our after-school program coordinator is fantastic. She'll make sure he feels welcome." As they prepared to leave, Marcus approached Richard with the serious expression they were beginning to recognize as his thinking face. "Mr. Richard?" he said. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why are you being so nice to us?" The question hung in the air, simple and profound. Richard knelt down so he could look Marcus in the eye, this remarkable child who asked the questions adults were afraid to voice. "Because you showed us something important," he said. "You reminded us that the best thing you can do with something precious is share it with someone who needs it more." Marcus considered this seriously, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. 3 months later, the transformation was remarkable, but not in the way others might expect. Maria had indeed thrived in her new position, her organizational skills and attention to detail making her invaluable to the Blackstone Technology Group. She'd moved out of the cramped apartment into a modest but comfortable 2-bedroom place in a safer neighborhood, with reliable heat and windows that actually closed properly. Marcus had enrolled in a private school with an excellent art program, but more importantly, he was eating regular meals and had time to be a child rather than a helper. His teachers reported that he was exceptionally bright and compassionate, often helping classmates who struggled with their work. But the most significant change was in the Blackstone family itself. Victoria had taken a leave of absence from her various social obligations to spend more time with Isabella, and to her surprise, she'd discovered that she actually enjoyed motherhood when she wasn't trying to fit it around charity luncheons and society meetings. Isabella, meanwhile, had become a happier, more secure baby, and Mr. Hopscotch remained her constant companion. Richard had restructured their foundation to focus on direct aid to families in need, particularly those with children showing exceptional promise despite difficult circumstances. The Marcus Initiative, as they privately called it, had already helped dozens of families in situations similar to what the Gonzalez family had faced. But perhaps the most profound change was in their understanding of what it meant to be wealthy, to have resources that most people could only dream of. They'd begun to see their money not as a source of comfort and status, but as a tool for creating opportunities for others. On a warm spring evening, they sat in Romano's again, but this time as part of a monthly tradition. Marcus and Maria joined them for dinner, a celebration of their expanding friendship and the ways their lives had become intertwined. Isabella, now walking and chattering constantly, toddles between the adults, Mr. Hopscotch tucked under one arm. The rabbit looked even more worn than before, loved now by 2 children instead of 1, but somehow that made it more precious rather than less. "Mrs. Patterson says I can enter the district art contest," Marcus announced, his face glowing with excitement. "The theme is family, and I want to draw all of us." "All of us?" Victoria asked, touched by the inclusion. "You and Mr. Richard and Isabella are family now too," Marcus said with the matter-of-fact certainty that only children possess. "Mama says family isn't just about blood. It's about people who take care of each other." Maria smiled, her hand finding Marcus's shoulder. The past few months had been a whirlwind of change, but good change, the kind that felt like finally being able to breathe after holding your breath for years. Her new job had given her not just financial stability, but a sense of professional pride she'd almost forgotten she could feel. More importantly, it had given Marcus opportunities she'd only dreamed of providing. "That's beautiful, Marcus," Richard said, and meant it. The boy's simple wisdom continued to surprise him, cutting through adult complications to find the heart of things. "I'd be honored to be in your family portrait." Isabella chose that moment to toddle over to Marcus, holding up Mr. Hopscotch with both hands as if offering him back. It had become a ritual between them, this offering and gentle refusal, as if she understood that the rabbit was on loan and wanted to make sure Marcus knew he could reclaim his friend at any time. "He's yours now, Isabella," Marcus said gently, the same words he'd spoken dozens of times over the past months. "But I'll visit him whenever you want." The little girl beamed and hugged the rabbit tighter, then surprised everyone by leaning over to give Marcus a wet, enthusiastic kiss on the cheek. The gestures sent a wave of laughter around the table, but underneath the humor was a deeper recognition of the bond that had formed between these 2 children from such different worlds. "You know," Victoria said, watching the interaction with wondering eyes, "I never thought I'd say this, but that old rabbit has become one of our most treasured possessions." "It's not about the rabbit," Marcus replied, his insight once again piercing straight to the truth. "It's about sharing something that matters." The conversation drifted to other topics. As their meal progressed, school and work, plans for the summer, Marcus's excitement about his first piano lesson the following week. But Richard found himself studying the boy throughout the evening, marveling at how someone so young had managed to change the trajectory of so many lives simply by responding to need with generosity. It wasn't just the immediate impact on the Gonzalez family, though that was significant. Marcus's act of kindness had rippled outward in ways none of them had anticipated. The Marcus Initiative had grown beyond their wildest expectations, with other wealthy families joining their efforts after hearing the story. What had started as help for one family had become a movement, a recognition that privilege carried responsibility and that the most meaningful change happened through personal connection rather than distant charity. But, perhaps more importantly, Marcus had given them all permission to be more human, to acknowledge that wealth and status meant nothing if they weren't used in service of something greater than comfort and ego. "Mama?" Marcus said suddenly, his voice carrying the tone he used when he'd been thinking hard about something. "Do you remember when we used to worry about whether we'd have enough food for the week?" Maria's fork paused halfway to her mouth. It wasn't a topic they discussed often, both because it was painful to remember and because they were still adjusting to the security of knowing that worry was behind them. "I remember," she said softly. "I used to think that was normal," Marcus continued, his young face serious. "I thought everybody had to choose between buying food and keeping the lights on. I didn't know that some kids never had to worry about that." The adults around the table grew quiet, recognizing that Marcus was processing something important. "But now I understand something," he went on. "The reason we were okay, even when things were scary, was because we had each other. And now we have more people who care about us, but the important part is still the same." "What's the important part?" Cash," Richard asked gently. Marcus looked around the table, his gaze touching each face with the kind of attention that made adults feel truly seen. "The important part is remembering that everyone needs help sometimes, and everyone has something to give. Even when I didn't have much, I had Mr. Hopscotch to share. Even when you have a lot, you still need friends. You." The simplicity of his philosophy was staggering. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes, understanding that this 8-year-old had articulated something she'd spent years trying to figure out through therapy and panned. Self-help books and philosophical discussions with other wealthy women who felt empty despite having everything money could buy. "You're absolutely right," she said, her voice slightly hoarse. "We all need each other. That's why I want to be a teacher when I grow up," Marcus announced, as if this were a natural conclusion to his thoughts. "Teachers help kids learn things, but they also help them understand that they're important, that they matter. Mrs. Patterson does that for me." "Mrs. Patterson sounds wonderful," Maria said, pride evident in her voice. Marcus's teacher had been another revelation, a dedicated professional who recognized his potential and had been instrumental in helping him adjust to his new school. She says I have a gift for seeing what other people need." Marcus paused, considering. "I think maybe everybody has that gift, but sometimes they forget to use it." Richard felt something settle in his chest, a peace he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. They'd begun this journey thinking they were helping a family in need, but Marcus had taught them that the help flowed both ways. He'd given them purpose, shown them what it meant to use their resources meaningfully, reminded them that wealth was only valuable when it was shared. "Marcus," he said carefully, "how would you feel about helping us with something?" The boy's eyes brightened with interest. "What kind of help?" "Well, we've been working on this program to help other families. Families like yours used to be, but we're not sure we're doing it right. We know about business and money, but you know about what it's really like to need help. Would you be willing to be our advisor?" Marcus's chest puffed up with pride at being asked for such grown-up assistance. "What would I need to do?" "Help us understand what would actually be helpful," Victoria explained. "Sometimes adults think they know what people need, but we don't always get it right. Like when rich people donate old fancy clothes to homeless shelters," Marcus said with startling insight, "but what people really need is warm coats and sturdy shoes. Exactly like that, Richard said, impressed once again by the boy's understanding. The conversation continued late into the evening, with Marcus offering suggestions and observations that were both practical and profound. He talked about the importance of letting people keep their dignity while receiving help, about the difference between charity that made the giver feel good and aid that actually improved lives. "The best part about Mr. Richard and Mrs. Victoria helping us," he said at one point, "is that they made it so Mama could take care of us better, instead of just taking care of us themselves. That way, Mama still gets to be my mom, but she doesn't have to worry so much about the scary stuff." It was, Maria thought, a perfect summation of what they'd done right. They'd strengthened the family unit rather than replacing it, provided tools and opportunities rather than just handouts. As the evening wound down and they prepared to part ways, Isabella toddling sleepily between her parents while clutching Mr. Hopscotch, Marcus approached Victoria with something in his hand. "I made this for you," he said shyly, offering her a small drawing folded carefully in half. Victoria opened it to find a picture drawn in crayon and colored pencil, depicting the scene from that first night at the restaurant. But Marcus had drawn it from a different perspective, showing not just himself offering the rabbit to Isabella, but the faces of everyone watching, the moment of connection that had started everything. At the bottom, in his careful third-grade handwriting, he'd written, "Sometimes the best presents are the ones you give away." Victoria felt tears spill over then, unable to contain the emotion that had been building all evening. "Marcus, this is beautiful, thank you. It's for your office," he explained. "So you can remember that helping people isn't about having a lot of money. It's about paying attention and caring." Richard looked at the drawing over Victoria's shoulder, seeing their story reflected back through Marcus's eyes. The boy had captured something essential about that first night, the way a simple act of kindness had created a bridge between two very different worlds. "We'll treasure this," he said solemnly. "And we'll remember," Victoria added, understanding that Marcus was giving them more than just a drawing. He was getting them a mission, a reminder of what they'd learned about the true value of wealth and privilege. 6 months later, Richard stood in front of a room full of philanthropists and business leaders, delivering a speech about effective charity that had grown out of everything Marcus had taught them. The Marcus Initiative had expanded beyond their wildest dreams, not just helping individual families but changing the way their entire social circle thought about wealth and responsibility. But the real measure of their success wasn't in the numbers or the media coverage or the awards they'd won for their innovative approach to philanthropy. It was in the family they'd gained, in the way Marcus continued to challenge them to be better people. In Isabella's delighted laughter as she played with a worn stuffed rabbit that had become a symbol of everything they'd learned about the true meaning of generosity. Marcus, now 9 and thriving in his 4th-grade class, had indeed entered the district art contest with his family portrait. The drawing showed all of them gathered around a dinner table, but what made it special was the way he'd drawn their faces, each one glowing with the kind of happiness that came from genuine connection rather than material comfort. The portrait had won first place, but more importantly, it had been featured in the local newspaper alongside a story about the Marcus Initiative and the boy who had inspired it. The article had generated dozens of calls from other families in need and from wealthy individuals who wanted to help in meaningful ways. But Marcus remained remarkably unchanged by all the attention. He still approached the world with the same generous spirit that had started everything, still saw need before status, still believed in the fundamental goodness of people. He'd grown taller and more confident, his artwork had improved dramatically, and his grades reflected the stability and support he now enjoyed. But his essential character remained beautifully intact. "You know what I learned?" he said to Richard one afternoon as they sat in the Blackstone offices, Marcus working on homework while his mother finished her day. "I learned that when you give something away because someone needs it more than you do, you don't really lose it. It becomes bigger." Richard paused in his work, struck by the profundity of the observation. "What do you mean bigger?" Marcus looked up from his math worksheet, his pencil poised in the air as he considered how to explain. "Like Mr. Hopscotch. When I gave him to Isabella, I didn't stop having him. Now he takes care of both of us. And all the happiness he brings her makes me happy too. So there's more happiness than there was before." It's bigger. It was, Richard realized, a perfect description of what had happened to all of them. By sharing their resources, their time, their lives with the Gonzalez family, they hadn't lost anything. Instead, they gained more than they'd ever imagined possible. More meaning, more purpose, more joy. That's very wise, he said. Marcus grinned and returned to his homework, but his words stayed with Richard long after the boy had gone home. In his corporate world, everything was about acquisition, about gaining market share and increasing profits and accumulating more. But Marcus had shown him a different kind of mathematics, one where giving multiplied rather than subtracted, where sharing created abundance rather than scarcity. That evening, Richard shared the conversation with Victoria as they watched Isabella play in her nursery, Mr. Hopscotch, still her favorite toy despite the room full of expensive alternatives. "He's going to change the world," Victoria said with quiet certainty. "Not because of what we've given him, but because of who he already was. Who he still is," Richard corrected. "That's what amazes me. We've given him opportunities, security, access to better schools and resources, but we haven't changed his heart. He's still the same boy who heard a baby crying and wanted to help. Maybe that's the point," Victoria mused. "Maybe the goal isn't to change people, but to give them the tools to become more fully themselves." It was a conversation they'd had variations of many times over the past year, this ongoing attempt to understand what they'd learned from Marcus and his family. The boy had taught them that generosity wasn't about what you could afford to give away, but about recognizing need and responding to it with whatever you had available. He'd shown them that dignity was more important than charity, that empowerment was more valuable than dependency. But perhaps most importantly, he demonstrated that the distance between different social classes wasn't as vast as they'd imagined. The same hopes and dreams, the same desire for security and opportunity, the same capacity for love and kindness existed at every economic level. The only real difference was access to resources and opportunities. A year after that first night at Romanos, they gathered there again for what had become an annual celebration. Marcus, now 10 and in 5th grade, had grown several inches and gained a confidence that came from knowing he was valued and supported. Maria had been promoted twice at Blackstone Technology and was considering taking college courses in business management. Isabella, approaching her 2nd birthday, was a happy, secure toddler who still slept with Mr. Hopscotch every night. "I have an announcement," Marcus said as they finished their meal, his voice carrying the importance of someone with significant news to share. "What's that?" Victoria asked, smiling at his serious expression. "I've decided what I want to be when I grow up," he declared. "I want to be a teacher, like I said before, but not just any teacher. I want to be the kind of teacher who helps kids understand that they can change things, that they don't have to just accept the way things are." "That sounds like an excellent goal," Richard said, touched by the boy's ambition. "And I want to start a program," Marcus continued, his ideas tumbling out with enthusiasm, "where kids from different schools can meet each other and be friends. Like, kids from schools like mine now, and kids from schools like I used to go to. Because I think if everyone knew each other better, they'd want to help each other more." The adults exchanged glances, recognizing the profound wisdom in Marcus's simple proposal. He'd identified one of the root causes of social inequality, the way physical and economic segregation prevented people from different backgrounds from recognizing their shared humanity. "That's brilliant," Maria said, pride evident in her voice. "How would it work?" Marcus launched into an explanation that revealed how much thought he'd put into the idea. He talked about art exchanges, where students could share their creative work across schools. He described pen pal programs and joint field trips, reading partnerships and community service projects that would bring children together around shared goals. "The thing is," he said, his voice growing more passionate as he explained, "when you don't know someone, it's easy to think they're totally different from you. But when you actually meet them and talk to them, you realize you like the same things, and worry about the same stuff, and want the same kinds of things to happen in your life." End quote. Victoria felt goosebumps rise on her arms. This child, who had started their journey by sharing a stuffed rabbit with a crying baby, was now proposing solutions to social problems that had stumped policymakers and sociologists for decades. "Marcus," Richard said carefully, "how would you feel about presenting this idea to some people who might be able to help make it happen?" The boy's eyes widened. "Really? Like who?" "Well, there are people who work in education policy, people who run foundations that support schools, people who could provide funding for programs like this. Would they listen to me? I'm just a kid." "You're not just anything," Victoria said firmly. "You're someone who has lived in both worlds, who understands both perspectives. That makes you exactly the right person to propose solutions." The conversation continued late into the evening, with Marcus's ideas growing more sophisticated as the adults asked questions and offered suggestions. By the time they parted ways, they had the outline of a program that could potentially transform how children from different socioeconomic backgrounds interacted with each other. But more than that, they had witnessed something remarkable: the full flowering of a child's potential when given the support and encouragement he needed to dream big. Marcus hadn't just been lifted out of poverty. He'd been empowered to lift others, to use his experiences as a bridge between worlds that too often remained separate. 2 years later, the Marcus Bridge Program, as it came to be known, was operating in 12 school districts across 3 states. Marcus, now 12 and in 7th grade, served as the program's youngest advisor, helping to design curricula and activities that fostered genuine connection between students from different backgrounds. The program's success had attracted national attention, not just for its innovative approach, but for its origin story. The tale of a boy who had given away his most precious possession to comfort a stranger's child, and, in doing so, had changed multiple lives forever. Marcus had appeared on several television programs, always accompanied by his mother and the Blackstones, always careful to emphasize that the program's success belonged to everyone involved, not just to him. His natural charisma and profound insight had made him a powerful advocate for educational equity and social justice, but he remained remarkably grounded, still the same child who saw need first and responded with whatever he had to give. Isabella, now 3.5, remained devoted to Mr. Hopscotch, the stuffed rabbit that had started everything. The toy showed its age and love, patches covering worn spots, one ear hanging by a few threads, stuffing beginning to show through carefully mended seams. But Isabella treasured it more than any of her newer, more expensive toys, perhaps sensing the history it carried. "Tell me the story again," she would say at bedtime, and Victoria would recount the tale of how Marcus had given his special friend to a crying baby, how that act of kindness had brought their families together, how love shared multiplied rather than diminished. The story had become family legend, but also something more, a parable that illustrated profound truths about generosity, connection, and the way individual actions could ripple outward to create unexpected change. Richard and Victoria had been transformed by their relationship with the Gonzalez family in ways they continued to discover. Their marriage had deepened as they found shared purpose in meaningful work. Their parenting had become more intentional as they learned from Maria's example of raising a child with such strong values despite challenging circumstances. Their understanding of wealth and privilege had evolved from entitlement to stewardship, from accumulation to circulation. The Marcus Initiative had grown into a significant philanthropic organization, but it maintained the personal touch that had made it effective from the beginning. Every family they helped was seen as individuals with unique needs and strengths, not just statistics or charity cases. The approach Marcus had taught them, recognizing people's dignity while providing practical support, had become their organizational philosophy. On Marcus's 13th birthday, they threw a party that reflected the unusual nature of their blended family. The guest list included classmates from his private school, children from the Bridge program, the Blackstones' wealthy friends, and families who had been helped by the Marcus Initiative. It was exactly the kind of diverse gathering that Marcus himself would have designed, bringing together people who might never have met otherwise. As Richard watched the party unfold, children from vastly different backgrounds playing together while their parents talked and laughed, he marveled at what one small act of kindness had created. None of this would have existed if Marcus hadn't heard Isabella crying that night at Romanos, if he hadn't reached into his backpack and pulled out his most treasured possession to offer comfort to a stranger. But perhaps that was the real lesson, that kindness was always available as a choice, regardless of circumstances. Marcus had been poor in every material sense, but rich in empathy and generosity. The Blackstones had been wealthy beyond measure, but impoverished in their understanding of what truly mattered. Through their unlikely friendship, both families had found what they'd been missing. "What are you thinking about?" Victoria asked, joining Richard as he stood somewhat apart from the celebration, observing. "I'm thinking about how different our lives would be if we hadn't decided to have dinner at Romano's that night," he said. "If we'd chosen a different restaurant, if Marcus hadn't been there, if Isabella hadn't started crying at just that moment. Do you think it was coincidence?" Victoria asked. Richard considered the question seriously. He wasn't particularly religious or mystical, but there had been something almost magical about the convergence of events that had brought them together. "I think maybe it was meant to happen. Maybe Marcus was meant to teach us what we needed to learn. And maybe we were meant to provide him with opportunities to use his gifts more widely," Victoria added. They stood together watching Marcus move through the party, checking on younger children, including quiet guests and conversations, making sure everyone felt welcome. At 13, he was already displaying the leadership qualities that would undoubtedly serve him well in whatever path he chose to follow. "He's going to do amazing things," Victoria said softly. "He's already doing amazing things," Richard corrected. "He's been doing them since he was 8 years old." As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Marcus approached the Blackstones with Isabella in tow, the little girl clutching Mr. Hopscotch as always. "Thank you for the party," he said, his formal politeness still intact after all these years of privilege. "It was perfect." "You're welcome," Victoria said, hugging him. "Though I think you're the one who made it perfect by being yourself." Marcus smiled, then looked down at Isabella. "Isabella, do you want to tell them what we talked about?" The little girl nodded solemnly, her face serious with the weight of important news. "Marcus says, when I'm bigger, I can help with the bridge program too. I can visit schools and tell them about sharing." "That's wonderful," Richard said, touched by the way Marcus continued to think about expanding opportunities for others. "She understands about Mr. Hopscotch," Marcus explained. "She knows he's special because he brings people together. She wants to help other kids learn how to do that too." It was perfect, this passing of wisdom and purpose from one generation to the next. The way Marcus's lesson about generosity and kindness was already being absorbed by Isabella, who would carry it forward in her own way. As the families prepared to go their separate ways, Marcus hugged each of the Blackstones goodbye, but he saved his longest embrace for Isabella, whispering something in her ear that made her diggle and squeeze Mr. Hopscotch tighter. "What did you tell her?" Victoria asked curiously. Marcus grinned, his expression holding just a hint of the mischief that had been largely overshadowed by his serious nature. "I told her that Mr. Hopscotch has one more important job to do." "What's that?" "Someday, when she meets someone who needs him more than she does, she'll know what to do." The simplicity and beauty of it took Victoria's breath away. Marcus had created a legacy that would extend far beyond his own lifetime, a chain of kindness that could theoretically continue forever, passed from child to child, need to need, heart to heart. Years later, when Marcus graduated as valedictorian from his high school and earned a full scholarship to study education and social policy at an Ivy League university, he would give a speech that referenced that first night at Romano's. He would talk about the power of small kindnesses to create large changes, about the responsibility that came with any kind of privilege, about the importance of seeing past differences to recognize shared humanity. But in that moment, as a 13-year-old boy at his birthday party, he was simply proud to have helped create something beautiful, something that brought people together instead of keeping them apart. Maria watched her son with wonder that never seemed to fade. The scared, hungry child who had once shared his only treasure with a crying baby had grown into a young man with vision and purpose, someone who understood that true wealth lay not in what you accumulated, but in what you shared. The opportunities the Blackstones had provided had been crucial, but Marcus's essential character, his generous heart and wise spirit, had been there all along, waiting for the right circumstances to flourish. As the last guests departed and the cleanup began, the two families worked together as they always had. The boundaries between employer and employee, benefactor and recipient, long since dissolved into something more calm, meaningful. They were family in the truest sense, bound not by blood but by love, respect, and shared commitment to making the world a little better than they'd found it. The story that had begun with a crying baby and a worn stuffed rabbit had evolved into something none of them could have imagined, a testament to the extraordinary power of ordinary kindness. And at the center of it all was Marcus, no longer the hungry child who washed dishes in the back of a restaurant, but still the same person who heard need and responded with whatever he had to give. In the end, that was the real miracle. Not that circumstances had changed, but that goodness had been recognized, nurtured, and allowed to flourish. Marcus had taught them all that wealth meant nothing without generosity, that privilege was meaningless without service, that the greatest gift anyone could give was simply to care enough to pay attention to the needs of others. And somewhere in the Blackstone mansion, a little girl slept peacefully with a threadbare stuffed rabbit, dreaming perhaps of the day when she too would have the chance to share something precious with someone who needed it more. Continuing the chain of kindness that had already changed so many lives and would undoubtedly change many more. The story was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. 5 years passed with the steady rhythm of growth and achievement. Marcus, now 18 and preparing for his freshman year at Harvard, had spent his high school summers working with the Marcus Bridge program, watching it expand to reach children in urban and rural communities across the country. The program had evolved beyond his original vision, incorporating technology to connect classrooms virtually, creating mentorship networks between older and younger students, and developing curricula that addressed not just social inequality, but environmental justice and global citizenship. His graduation speech had been broadcast nationally, picked up by news networks that were drawn to the story of a young man whose childhood act of kindness had sparked a movement. But Marcus had used the platform not to celebrate his own achievements, but to highlight the work still to be done, the children who remained voiceless, the communities that lacked resources, the systemic changes that were needed to create real equity. "Education saved my life," he had said, standing at the podium before an audience that included some of the most powerful people in the country. But it shouldn't be a matter of luck or charity. Every child deserves the chance to discover their potential, regardless of where they're born or how much money their parents have. The speech had generated millions of views online and prompted several universities to invite Marcus to speak about educational equity. More importantly, it had inspired a new generation of young activists who saw him as proof that their voices mattered, that change was possible. Isabella, now 8 years old and in 3rd grade herself, had become Marcus's unofficial ambassador to younger children. She still treasured Mr. Hopscotch, though the rabbit now spent most of his time in a place of honor on her bookshelf, too fragile for daily play, but too precious to put away completely. Isabella had developed into a confident, articulate child who spoke easily about fairness and kindness, often surprising adults with her insights about social justice. At school, she had started a kindness club that encouraged students to look for opportunities to help others, whether through small acts of generosity or larger service projects. The club's first initiative had been collecting books for underfunded libraries, but it had quickly expanded to include food drives, environmental cleanups, and letter-writing campaigns to isolated elderly teen residents. "She's definitely your influence," Victoria often told Marcus when Isabella launched into passionate explanations about inequality or environmental protection. "She's her own person," Marcus would reply, though he couldn't hide his pride in the young girl who had been shaped by the same values that had guided his own development. The Blackstone family dynamics had continued to evolve in unexpected ways. Richard had stepped back from day-to-day business operations to focus full-time on the Marcus Initiative, which had grown into a major foundation with a staff of dozens and an annual budget in the millions. But it maintained its personal approach, with Richard and Victoria still reviewing every application personally, still meeting with families to understand their unique situations. Victoria had discovered a talent for grant writing and program development, skills she'd never needed in her previous life of social events and shopping. She completed a master's degree in nonprofit management, studying alongside students half her age, and bringing a perspective shaped by her unusual journey from privileged socialite to hands-on advocate. Maria had been promoted to Director of Operations at the Foundation, her organizational skills and deep understanding of the challenges facing low-income families making her invaluable in designing effective VNNA programs. She'd also completed her bachelor's degree, attending evening classes while working full-time, motivated by the same determination that had carried her through the hardest years of raising Marcus alone. The success of the Marcus Initiative had attracted imitators and critics in equal measure. Some philanthropists had launched similar programs, though few maintained the personal touch and dignity-focused approach that had made the original so effective. Critics argued that private charity, no matter how well-intentioned, couldn't address systemic problems that required political solutions. Marcus listened to both praise and criticism with the same thoughtful attention he'd always given to different perspectives. At 18, he understood that the work they'd begun was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, that individual kindness and systemic change needed to work together to create lasting transformation. His freshman year at Harvard brought new challenges and opportunities. The campus was a world away from the cramped apartment where he'd grown up, but also different from the comfortable suburban life he'd lived with the Foundation's support. Here, he was surrounded by young people from privileged backgrounds who took their opportunities for granted, but also by scholarship students like himself who carried the weight of representing their communities and crude families. Marcus found himself serving as an informal counselor to other first-generation college students, helping them navigate not just academic challenges, but the cultural differences that could make elite, institutions feel alien and unwelcoming. His dorm room became a gathering place for students who felt caught between worlds, unsure how to maintain their authentic selves while adapting to their new environment. "The thing is," he explained to a group of students one evening as they sat in his room discussing their experiences, "you don't have to choose between where you came from and where you're going. The point is to use every part of your story to help other people." One of the students, a young woman named Aaliyah from rural Mississippi, looked up from her economics textbook. "But sometimes, it feels like I'm betraying my family by being here. Like I'm saying their way of life wasn't good enough." Marcus nodded, recognizing the guilt he'd sometimes felt about his own transformed circumstances. "I used to worry about that too. But then I realized that getting an education doesn't mean you think less of your family. It means you're trying to build a bridge so other people from your community can cross over too." These conversations reminded him daily of why his work mattered, why the bridge program needed to expand, why systematic change was essential. College was revealing to him the full scope of educational inequality, not just in terms of resources, but in terms of cultural capital, the unspoken knowledge about how institutions worked that privileged students absorbed from birth. During his winter break, Marcus returned home to find that the Foundation had received an unexpected challenge. A billionaire tech entrepreneur had announced his intention to fund a competing program, one that would provide direct cash payments to low-income families without the personal engagement and dignity-focused approach that characterized the Marcus Initiative. "It's just another example of throwing money at problems without understanding them," Richard said during a Foundation meeting, his frustration evident. He thinks efficiency means removing the human element. "But some people are saying his approach could help more families," Victoria pointed out, playing devil's advocate. "The cash payments would reach thousands of people we can't serve with our current model." Marcus listened to the debate, recognizing the tension between scale and depth that every nonprofit eventually faced. During his semester at Harvard, he'd studied similar dilemmas in his social policy courses, learning about the trade-offs involved in different approaches to addressing poverty and inequality. "What if we're thinking about this wrong?" he said finally. "What if instead of seeing his program as competition, we saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate different approaches?" The room fell quiet as the adults turned to him, curious about his perspective. "Cash payments can address immediate needs," Marcus continued, his thoughts organizing themselves as he spoke. "That's important, but they don't address the systemic barriers that keep people in poverty, the lack of educational opportunities, the absence of social networks, the cultural capital that privileged families pass down automatically." So, you're saying both approaches are needed? Maria asked. I'm saying maybe we should partner with him, Marcus replied, the idea crystallizing as he voiced it. What if families could receive immediate financial support through his program, while also getting the longer-term educational and mentorship support through ours? What if we could demonstrate that comprehensive approaches work better than either cash or services alone? The suggestion sparked intense discussion, with some board members worried about diluting their brand and others excited about the possibility of reaching more families. Marcus listened to all perspectives, but he was already thinking beyond the immediate decision to larger questions about how different organizations could work together rather than competing for limited philanthropic gain. Dollars. The partnership negotiations took months, requiring Marcus to defer enrollment for the spring semester so he could serve as a bridge between the two organizations. His unique position, as both a beneficiary of the Marcus Initiative's approach and a Harvard student capable of understanding complex policy discussions, made him an ideal mediator. The tech entrepreneur, Jonathan Chen, initially dismissed Marcus as a symbolic figurehead, assuming the real decisions were being made by the adult board members. But after several conversations, Chen began to recognize that Marcus brought insights that no one else possessed. "You're not just telling me what works," Chen said during one particularly productive meeting. "You're explaining why it works, what it feels like from the inside. That's the part that gets lost when you only look at data," Marcus replied. "Numbers can tell you how many people you've helped, but they can't tell you whether you've helped them in a way that preserves their dignity and builds their capacity for independence." The pilot program that emerged from their collaboration was more ambitious than either organization had originally envisioned. Participating families would receive immediate financial support to address crisis needs, followed by comprehensive assessments to identify educational opportunities, career development goals, and community connections. The Marcus Initiative would provide mentorship and advocacy, while Chen's foundation would fund direct services and emergency assistance. Most importantly, families would be involved in designing their own support plans, recognizing that people experiencing poverty were experts on their own situations and needed to be partners in creating solutions rather than passive recipients of charity. The pilot launched in 3 cities, with Marcus spending his gap year traveling between sites, learning from participating families, and helping to refine the program based on their feedback. The experience was transformative for him, deepening his understanding of the diversity of experiences within poverty and the complexity of creating effective interventions. In Detroit, he met a single father working 3 jobs who needed childcare support more than additional income. In Phoenix, he encountered a grandmother raising her grandchildren who required help navigating bureaucratic systems to access existing benefits. In rural Kentucky, he worked with a family whose main barrier was transportation, living too far from services and employment opportunities to benefit from programs designed for urban populations. Each family taught him something new about the intersection of individual resilience and systemic barriers, about the creativity and strength that people developed in response to challenging circumstances, about the importance of tailoring solutions to specific needs rather than assuming one-size-fits-all approaches. "The most important thing I've learned," he wrote in his journal during this period, "is that poverty is not a character flaw or a lack of motivation. It's a complex web of circumstances that requires equally complex responses. The families I'm meeting aren't looking for handouts. They're looking for hand-ups, for opportunities to use their own strengths to build better lives." End quote. These insights shaped his college application essays when he reapplied for admission the following year, but they also influenced his thinking about his long-term career goals. While he'd always planned to become a teacher, his gap year experience convinced him that he needed to understand policymaking and systems change at the highest levels. Isabella, meanwhile, had continued to develop her own understanding of social justice, influenced by Marcus's work, but shaped by her own experiences and observations. At 9, she was already demonstrating leadership skills that impressed her teachers and surprised her parents. Her Kindness Club had evolved into a student organization that partnered with local nonprofits on service projects. But Isabella had also begun asking harder questions about why some schools had abundant resources while others lacked basic supplies, why some neighborhoods had parks and libraries while others had food deserts and inadequate public transportation. "It's not fair that Marcus had to be lucky to get a good education," she said one day after visiting one of the bridge program sites. "All kids should have good schools." Victoria found herself having increasingly sophisticated conversations with her daughter about inequality and justice. Amazed by the child's ability to grasp complex social issues and her determination to take action rather than simply feeling bad about problems. When Isabella turned 10, she asked for her birthday party to be a fundraiser for the Marcus Initiative rather than a traditional celebration. The event raised several $1,000s, but more importantly, it introduced her classmates and their families to the foundation's work in a way that was educational rather than preachy. "She's going to change the world," Maria said, watching Isabella explain the bridge program to a group of adults who listened with the respectful attention usually reserved for much older speakers. "She already is," Marcus replied, recognizing in Isabella the same passion for justice that had driven his own development, but expressed through her unique personality and circumstances. By the time Marcus enrolled at Harvard for his sophomore year, the pilot program had generated enough positive results to attract national attention. Academic researchers wanted to study their model. Government officials asked them to testify about effective anti-poverty strategies, and other foundations began developing similar collaborative approaches. But success also brought new challenges. Media attention sometimes oversimplified their work, focusing on feel-good stories rather than the complex realities of addressing systemic inequality. Political figures tried to co-opt their message for their own agendas, claiming their success as validation for approaches the foundation had never endorsed. Marcus found himself learning to navigate these pressures while maintaining focus on the work itself. His communications courses at Harvard helped him understand how to frame messages effectively. But his lived experience kept him grounded in the reality that behind every statistic was a family with hopes, dreams, and challenges that couldn't be reduced to talking points. The foundation's influence continued to expand, but so did Marcus's understanding of the limits of private philanthropy. His political science courses introduced him to debates about the role of private charity in addressing public problems, the ways that voluntary giving could sometimes excuse government inaction on issues that tabulai required systemic solutions. "Or treating symptoms," he said during a foundation meeting via video call from his dorm room. "That's important work, but we also need to think about how to address causes." "What do you mean?" Richard asked, though he suspected he knew where Marcus was heading. "I mean that we can help individual families escape poverty, but we can't fix the systems that create poverty in the first place. That requires political action, policy changes, structural reforms that are beyond what any foundation can accomplish." The observation sparked lengthy discussions about the foundation's role and limitations, conversations that were both philosophical and practical. How could they continue helping families while also advocating for broader changes? How could they maintain their nonpartisan status while addressing issues that had unavoidable political dimensions? Marcus proposed that the foundation begin supporting civic engagement and political participation among the communities they served, not by endorsing specific candidates or parties, but by providing education about the political process and encouragement for people to make their voices heard. "Democracy only works when everyone participates," he argued. "If we're helping families build better lives, but they don't have a voice in the decisions that affect their communities, we're only addressing half the problem." The proposal was controversial among some board members who worried about jeopardizing the foundation's tax-exempt status, but it reflected Marcus's growing sophistication about the relationship between individual and systemic change. As his sophomore year progressed, Marcus began to envision a future that combined direct service with policy advocacy, education with political engagement. He was majoring in government with a focus on social policy, but he was also taking courses in education, economics, and communications, building a foundation for work that would span multiple disciplines. His professors recognized his unique perspective and often asked him to share his experiences in class discussions. Unlike many students who approached social policy as an abstract intellectual exercise, Marcus brought first-hand knowledge of what it meant to be on the receiving end of various programs and interventions. Most anti-poverty programs are designed by people who have never experienced poverty, he said during one seminar discussion. That's not necessarily wrong, but it means they often miss important details about how policies actually affect people's daily lives. The comment sparked a debate about the role of lived experience in policymaking, with some students arguing that objective analysis was more important than personal perspective, while others contended that meaningful solutions required input from affected communities. Marcus listened to both sides, recognizing the value in different approaches, while also understanding that the debate itself reflected broader questions about who gets to shape the policies that affect other people's lives. These academic discussions informed his thinking about his own future role. He was beginning to understand that his unique position, bridging different worlds and speaking multiple languages of experience, gave him opportunities and responsibilities that few people possessed. During spring break of his sophomore year, Marcus returned home to find that Isabella had launched her most ambitious project yet. Working with her kindness club, she had convinced her school to partner with an elementary school in a low-income neighborhood for a year-long exchange program. We're going to visit each other's schools, work on projects together, and learn about each other's communities, she explained excitedly. And next year, we want to do it with schools in other countries too. The project was a smaller-scale version of Marcus's bridge program, but designed and implemented entirely by 10-year-olds. Watching Isabella present her plans to school administrators and parent groups, Marcus was struck by how naturally she had absorbed the principles of dignified engagement and mutual learning that had taken him years to articulate. "She's not just copying what we've done," Victoria observed. "She's innovating, finding new ways to apply the same values." The observation reminded Marcus that movements for social change had to continue evolving, that each generation would need to find its own ways of addressing persistent problems. Isabella's approach reflected her generation's comfort with diversity and collaboration, their natural understanding that differences could be bridges rather than barriers. As Marcus prepared for his junior year, he felt the weight of expectations and opportunities that his unusual path had created. College had given him tools for analysis and communication, but it had also made him more aware of the complexity of the challenges he wanted to address. The foundation continued to grow and evolve, reaching thousands of families and inspiring dozens of similar organizations. The Bridge program had been implemented in hundreds of schools, creating connections across divides that had previously seemed unbridgeable. Isabella was developing into a formidable advocate in her own right, bringing fresh perspectives to conversations about justice and equity. But Marcus understood that their work was part of a much larger story, one that included countless other individuals and organizations working towards similar goals. The stuffed rabbit that had started it all still sat on Isabella's bookshelf, a reminder of how small acts of kindness could ripple outward in unexpected ways. But also, a symbol of the ongoing need for compassion and connection in a world that often seemed to reward the opposite values. As he packed for his return to Cambridge, Marcus reflected on how far they'd all come from that night at Romano's restaurant, when a crying baby had prompted an 8-year-old boy to offer his most precious possession. The child who had given away Mr. Hopscotch was now a young man with the opportunity to influence policy at the highest levels, but he carried with him the same instinct to respond to need with whatever resources he had available. The story continued to unfold, each chapter building on the last, each new challenge offering opportunities for growth and deeper understanding. Marcus knew that his role in this ongoing narrative was still being written, that the choices he made in the coming years would determine not just his own future, but the future of the movement he had inadvertently sparked. The Foundation's work would continue. Isabella would grow into her own leadership role, and new generations of children would learn about kindness and justice through programs that had emerged from a single moment of Dallas. Generosity. But perhaps most importantly, the values that had guided Marcus from childhood, the belief that everyone deserved dignity and opportunity, would continue to spread through countless interactions and decisions, creating a legacy that extended far beyond any individual achievement or recognition.